Well, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. It's a little bit after 11.
Chet, I think we're still awaiting Charles City County, Chesterfield County, Powhatan, Richmond, and Ms. Guthrie from Virginia Transit Association.
Okay, well, we'll hang out for another minute or two.
Okay.
Okay, looks like we have a quorum. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Chet Parsons. I'm Director of Transportation for Plan RVA, and this is the Friday, May 7th meeting of the CVTA Transit Service Governance Subcommittee. Welcome, everybody. I hope you're having a good day and looking forward to a nice weekend. We have a regular agenda today where we're going to be hearing an update from the AECOM team on the governance report. But before we get to that, let's go ahead and do a roll call for attendance, Nicole.
Thanks, Chet. I'll start with Charles City County, Ms. Russell. Chesterfield County, Ms. Smith.
Here.
Hanover County, Mr. Vidunas.
Here.
Henrico County, Mr. Yor.
Here.
Powhatan County, Mr. Chardine. City of Richmond, Ms. Clark.
Here.
DRPT, and I think it's Mr. Brule joining us today.
Yes, I'm here.
Good morning. Virginia Transit Association, Ms. Guthrie. GRTC, Ms. Torres.
Here.
And Plan RVA, Mr. Parsons.
Here.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call for attendance, and we have a quorum.
Thank you. Are there any amendments that would like to be requested to the meeting agenda? Hearing none, we'll move forward. Hopefully everybody had a chance to review the April 23rd meeting summary that was provided with the agenda. Anybody have any comments or corrections that need to be made? Okay, hearing none, we'll move ahead. Public comment period. There's a chance for anyone to share comments on the Transit Service Governance Report Subcommittee work. I'm not aware of any comments received. Nicole, have you seen anything?
No, sir, I have not.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, let's move into the main item on the agenda, which is the AECOM update on where things stand with the report development. And I will turn that over to Stephanie.
Sorry.
Hi, good morning. I'm trying to share the correct screen. Okay.
And Stephanie, your voice is a little bit soft, just to let you know.
Okay, can you hear me now? Is it much better?
Still a little
Or can
soft.
you hear?
Little soft.
Is it better now?
I could hear that.
Yes.
Okay, then we'll keep it at this. Sorry, I had to turn up the mic to the highest level. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us again. We're here to give you an update on where we are with the transit governance study we're currently conducting for the Richmond region. For today, we'll be looking at three main items. We'll give an update on one of our peer studies because that one came pretty late just this week. Our contact from Rock Region was able to come through. So we'll just do a quick update. And they do have some interesting information about their approach to tiered governance and tiered contributions in their at their agency. So that might be of interest to this committee. Next, we'll look at the general provisions of the transportation district and some details on what are the key advantages or potential issues with creating one here in the Richmond region. And then finally, we'll look at key governance issues and a set of potential governance recommendations to move forward with. These are just, again, first draft of potential recommendations or structures that we will still go through feedback from the various stakeholders, legal counsel of the city and of the transit agency to make sure that everything that is proposed is actually feasible and then get the most appropriate path to move forward. So in terms of our study progress, currently we are in phase 3, which is the development of the governance strategies. So today what we'll be looking at is the transportation district, one item from phase 1, and then part of phase 3. Once we complete phase 3, the next phase is to have that draft report for review and submission. So I'll just go right in to our first section, which is with Rock Region Metro. So Rock Region Metro is in Little Rock, Arkansas. They are founded as an authority. However, they don't have any taxation power. So they don't have authority to levy any sort of tax on their residents. How they fund their services is through contributions from the member cities. So they have two main member cities, the city of Little Rock and North Little Rock, then the county of Pulaski. And then they have some other smaller jurisdictions that are not big cities, but are within the counties. They also provide services to certain areas outside of the county. So in total, you can see they have the jurisdiction served here. Those smaller entities, smaller county cities are Momel, Sherwood, and Jacksonville. And so for their board makeup, they have a board of 12 members, and it's purely tiered based on the contribution rates. It was previously solely based on the amount of service that was consumed or provided, but now it's sort of a combination of population, service, as well as a contribution. So they have majority of the members coming from city of Little Rock, then the 3 from North Little Rock, 2 appointed by Pulaski County. So they call their, what in this area might be a commissioner, a county commissioner, or the head of the county, possibly like a mayor. They call it the county judge. So it's not any legal relationship, it's just the name that represents the head of the county. So the head of the county appoints 2 representatives also to the board. It's made up of citizen appointees, but with no elected officials. However, the citizen appointees do represent the needs or the interests of their appointing body. So there isn't any fiduciary responsibility there. According to their bylaws and their legislative documents, it's the the localities that are on the hook for anything that happens with the agency. So in that sense, they make sure to represent the views of the various appointing bodies. Maumelle and Sherwood are also represented on the board. So they also appoint one member each on the board. Another interesting thing is they have stand-in members who are the finance director and then the city manager for the city of Little Rock as permanent members of the board. So no matter how the board changes, those positions, they're staff positions. So they're always represented on the board. They have, right, as most boards do, they have officers that serve a 2-year term. And the officers are appointed by what they call they have a nominating committee. So the nominating committee appoints the officers. They also have some other committees, which is like the budget committee that reviews their annual budgets and make sure to go through any comments or revisions, but still sends it to the main board for final approval. They also have the personnel committee that deals with the CEO negotiations. And finally, they have the strategic planning committee. However, in recent years, the strategic planning committee has been sort of dormant. The purpose of the strategic planning committee is for communication with the board and having input on plans that are going on in terms of service planning for the agency. But in recent years, what they've done is just to present all that information to their board, since they find it much easier. And most of the board members are all interested in the information. So they've moved that strategic planning committee sort of and opened it up to the entire board. In forming a quorum, the agency, as most agencies do, they just need a 50% or more of members. No one agency has veto. However, by virtue of having that tiered representation on the board, they can have they can have certain jurisdictions like the city of Little Rock or North Little Rock could have more representation and vote for whatever within their in their favor. In terms of making governance structures, major changes will have to be made through the interlocal agreement. So their main document is an interlocal agreement between the governing bodies of the represented entities. So major changes, adding a member, removing a member would be made there. However, smaller changes, minor changes can be made at the board level by just changing the bylaws. So like I mentioned before, they have their board representation is tied to their member contribution, and which is also a function of their population and how much service is provided or is consumed within those localities. So they created this a new, what they call the local funding contribution formula. According to this formula, they have a tiered approach and it's based on 2 main factors. The first is their type. They have a partner type and then they have a cost type. So for the partner type, they have primary partners, secondary partners, and tertiary partners. Primary partners are the big 3, the 3 core localities. So City of Little Rock, City of North Little Rock, and Pulaski County. The secondary partners are other jurisdictions that are within Pulaski County, but are not, they're not as densely populated, or they don't have enough population to be able to support effective fixed route service. So they have other kinds of service. Now, what they used to previously have only or primarily express service downtown, in and out service. But now what is being done is revising those services to more of a micro transit approach. Now, some of the localities for the secondary partners, they can choose to maintain their express routes, but it's moving more towards that micro transit approach. Then third is the tertiary partners. Now, the tertiary partners are those that have contracted services and are outside of Pulaski County. So the difference between secondary and tertiary is because in Arkansas, they can have cities within counties. Since Pulaski County itself is a member, they provide some funds for the cities of Momel and Sherwood, which are much smaller and need some support. So in a sense, they are covered on certain types of costs, and we'll look at that when we get there for those two. However, for those that are outside the county that are not covered by Pulaski County in some sort of subsidy for their cost, they pay the full cost, the full amount that is required for providing whatever service. So they are the tertiary partners. They don't have a board seat yet. Jacksonville used to have a board seat, but now it's just contracted service. They do have a path if one wants to be part of the board, and we'll look at that in a few. For partners that want to receive service, they do have to commit to at least 2 full years, 2 full years of paying for the service. And if they have issues with paying for the total amount, because this is a new contribution formula, they provided a 5-year phasing plan where they start from where they currently are for the amount of service they are paying for, and then within 5 years reach that level of paying for the full cost of service. So I mentioned that there are 2 types of costs that are paid by the different types of partners. First, you have the fixed costs and the variable costs. The fixed costs stand for the costs that have to do with their admin, facility maintenance, the required paratransit service, as well as providing funding for reserve funds. Now, that reserve funds one is purely population based. So the fixed costs, when it breaks down, it goes to about 50% to Little Rock, City of Little Rock, about 33 to City of North Little Rock, and about 17 to Pulaski County. The next type of cost, the second type of cost that they have to pay is the variable costs. So those costs for fixed route are based on the service miles, and for microtransit is based on the service hours provided. So depending on what type of partner you are, you'll pay a combination of these types of costs. The reason they decided to move to this type of system was because they realized they didn't have enough funds. And as an entity that doesn't have dedicated transit funds, they were always at the mercy sort of the localities through like annual budget contributions. So they had a lot of fluctuations. But with this, they're able to at least request the appropriate amount of the full cost of actually providing that service. The way they came about this was they worked really closely with the finance departments and other staff personnel at the different localities, and so they worked together to come up with this system that they deemed equitable and would represent the full amount of providing transit service to any jurisdiction. So like I mentioned, they have a 2-year commitment for any entity that wants service, and the 5-year phase-in approach. So what you're looking at here, this table is a snapshot from one of their documents that shows the funding partners for primary and secondary and for the 2 types of costs. So for general revenue that is received from fares or any costs that are received from directly operating the transit service, it goes straight to the fixed cost. That is those admin costs, paratransit provision, or facilities, maintenance facilities, or the reserve funds. So all that revenue goes to the regular fixed cost. Then the next tier is that the primary funding partners, they cover, like I mentioned, depending on their population, that percentage of the regular fixed cost, which for now breaks out to about 50, 33, 17 for Little Rock, North Little Rock, and Pulaski County. The secondary funding partners don't contribute to fixed costs, the regular fixed costs at the moment, because they are covered by Pulaski County. But they still have to have skin in the game, right? So they do have to pay into the fixed cost reserve fund. Now, what that came up to be was they went through a lot of uh, mathematics and came up to about 1.78%. So the fixed cost plus their cost of service that they need to provide would be, if it takes, for example, if the variable cost was $100, to cover the fixed cost, they would pay $78 more. So for any type of service required, their ratio would be 178%. And that way they would cover the full amount of actually providing the service. Sorry, not the 78. They got the 78 and halved it. So they pay that 37. It's the tertiary partners that pay the 78% addition. So it would be 137 if you were a secondary partner, but if you were tertiary, you would pay 178. And the tertiary partners, again, are those that are not within the county, but still contract out for service. What you're looking at here is a chart that shows their sources of operating funds. As you can see, they have very little state funds, about 2%. Majority of their funds, their funding comes from their funding partners at the local level, the local governments, majority from the big three. And then they also have their fares and then other directly generated funds like from advertising, which is very small, or any parking. Then they also have the federal funding. They are thinking of looking into 5311 as a future funding source because it could be a potential revenue source if they provide those services as well. For capital, their main sources are the federal and the local, with the local match. So this covers just the review of Rock Region Metro. I think the most interesting thing about their agency is this new funding formula that they developed, and that could even be could be transferred into a sort of their governance, their board membership approach, which it follows. Next, we'll be looking at the details of a transportation district, the powers, the authorities, and examples of some districts in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, sorry. What is a transportation district? It really is one that can be created according to the provisions of the Transportation District Act of 1964. So within that act, it can be created within a single locality or two or more contiguous localities or governing bodies. Now, what they do, the purpose for creating a transportation district is if it is found out that there is potential for improving transportation of any kind, whether highway related or transit related, then those governing localities can come together to form a transportation district to plan for and implement any kind of transportation improvement that is needed within the area. So how this is done is they need to provide a name for the transportation district, but it will include the suffix transportation district of, then their name. They need to list out what transportation improvements that they think that this new entity can provide and have a plan for implementing those improvements. The district, when it's created, it can automatically expire after 35 years, or according to whatever provisions are written up and agreed upon by the members that are participating in such a district. Like I mentioned before, the transportation districts, it may be improvements that can related to transit, public transit systems, or can be highway related. So it can be related to interchanges, parking, bridges, tunnels, anything that has to do with transportation. One interesting thing about creating the transportation district is if it is for the purpose of providing transit services or a transit system, there is a provision within the law that requires the protection of employees that are in any existing public transit system within the locality or within the region that the transportation district is going to operate. So some of this is not limited to, but some of the protections that they must have is about for employment to the fullest extent possible. If there's going to be, if that won't be possible, then some sort of re-employment. They have to preserve any rights or benefits that they had from their previous employment. They need to have that protection for collective bargaining rights, um, whatever it was in their previous agency. There should also be a protection of the individuals against worsening their conditions. And this is a federal provision for transit agencies. Then also there should be any required paid training or retraining programs if they are to absorb any existing transit agencies. Mm. So the transportation district is governed by a transportation commission. So it'll be known as the district commission or the commission. Now, the commission is created to manage the affairs of the transportation district, and the members are made up of they're appointed by from within the governing bodies of the member localities. So in this sense, they can, if it's the city council, you have to have members of the city council on of the governing bodies. So that's how it works. The chairman of the CTB or a designee is also required to be a member. Then they can serve so this can be amended by what the member localities want, but there can be this 4-year term with a max of 2 consecutive terms. So this is an example from MVTA. They are required within 30 days of setting up the commission to create the officers, to elect or nominate officers that serve for 1 year each. The officers are the chairman and the vice chair. They can also have a secretary and a treasurer that do not have to be members of the appointing body. So they could be or could not be. If they're not members of the appointing body, then they need to, if there's any compensation that is required, that will need to be also resolved as part of this process. The transportation district will be, so their purpose is to provide transportation improvements. So as part of that, they have to do transportation planning. However, the law requires that they coordinate with the governing bodies of the localities, as well as any agencies or entities that are present within the area for the purpose of transportation planning to make sure that the growth and development is done in a cohesive way. They may create committees from personnel within bodies that exist already. So especially if they already have members of the commission that are also members of another transportation entity, they can utilize that to form these committees to ensure that the planning is done in a cohesive way. So currently, some examples of these transportation districts, which we've looked at, except for PRTC, are the MVTA, PRTC, and the Hampton Roads District Commission. One thing about the MVTA is that they also have they appoint the Virginia members for WMATA as well. So they have that cross membership. So there are several powers and duties of the Transportation District Commission.
Hey, Stephanie, it looks like Dorona had a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Chet. I was going to ask about the taxation power, and then this slide came up, so maybe she'll cover it here. A transportation district.
Yeah, so they do have authority to levy a tax. They may or may not, but they do have the authority to levy a tax within the districts that the localities are represented. They have the authority to use or spend that funding in a certain way, and some of that will be here. But with regard to like the detail of the cap and the amount, I can provide that later. I have it in my notes.
Thanks, Stephanie. I just think that that's important when thinking about any additional dedicated transit funds that could come about for regional transportation. Thank you.
Exactly. So they may levy an annual special tax. It could be real estate, a tax that is on taxable real estate. It cannot be more than 20 cents per $100 of the assessed market value of the properties. That limitation, it can be removed if any districts requested in writing, any members of the districts requested in writing. So that 20 cents per $100 cap may be removed. Any tax that is implemented it will come into effect, let me put it, on January 1st of the following year. And then all the revenues that are received by each locality will be paid to or at the direction of the district commission. So those are the details for the tax purposes. But the commission can also be formed without even implementing a new tax as well. Okay, so like I mentioned before, the district commission will prepare a transportation plan through cooperation with the governing bodies of its members. They also have the authority to construct and operate transportation improvements. So this includes transit, public transit. They can also acquire, sell, or transfer any of the transportation improvement, meaning they can acquire, purchase, sell any public transit that they wish to acquire. They can negotiate contracts for with any person, where a person will represent any entity. So not only an individual, but like a company, a corporation, or any entity for providing those transportation improvements. So it means that if they were to provide transit services, they could either provide it through the transit through the district commission or through contracted services. And they can, there's one interesting one for the counties of Chesterfield, Hanover, Henrico, and the city of Richmond. They cannot regulate taxi cab services unless permitted by those entities, those localities. They also can construct or contract out for any highway related projects within or outside of the district, the transportation district. They can employ personnel to make sure that any operation or work that needs to be done for any transportation improvement can be fulfilled. One of the things they have to do is have that annual audit for the financial obligations, but then they also have the authority to request an increase or adjustment to the rate if they've deemed that adjustment is necessary for providing the services for which it was created, or the improvements for which it was created. They also have the authority to issue bonds. They can also acquire median strips for future transportation projects for the purpose of creating public transit. So if there are future highway projects, they can acquire through the appropriate channels. It has to go through the CTB, and then they can acquire that right of way. Now, the thing is, a transportation district has many of the powers and authorities are very similar to that of the CVTA. The main difference between, I'd say the main difference in powers or authority will be that the CVTA cannot operate or construct transit, but a transportation district can. The CVTA can contract for such services, but so can a transportation district. So if there's a need or looking at creating such a transportation districts within the region, some things that would make it successful, or the key opportunities we could identify, are that with one of the governance issues currently is our representation of elected officials on any said transit board or transit governance board. With the creation of a transit district, a district commission will be set up, and such a district commission will the membership will be from the governing bodies of the member localities. So in that sense, that accountability can be provided through a transportation district commission. There's also the opportunity to create a new governance structure that would suit the CVTA membership. So what is meant by this is there's opportunity to start from scratch, to start afresh, to create such a district that can have members opt in or opt out in order to relate it to the governance of transit within the region. One of the authorities of the transit district is be able to acquire transit or transit facilities. So transit facilities not only representing buildings, but any assets related to the provision or operation of public transportation. So in this sense, a district commission could acquire the services of could acquire as a whole the entity of the public transit company within the Richmond region by transferring those assets and paying for it in an appropriate way. So an example of a potential approach would be perhaps a phased approach of either whether it's going to be, there are two options, right? To transfer the assets. Either it's going to be monetary, or it could be looked at as a depreciation of the assets. And that could be directly correlated to the board representation. So for example, for the interests that have majority stake in the transit company, they could have majority representation on the board. And then if it's over maybe a 25-year period, for example, or a 20-year period that it would take for those assets to depreciate in value, the representation can then be adjusted and skewed to the point that over that time period, whatever new governance structure that is set up, whether it is one member per one locality. So let's say if all 9 localities form a transit district and it's only one for one, just for example, over the 25-year period, it will skew from having more members from the current 2 majority shareholders to whatever is decided as that level playing field, or that fresh start. So the second option is also just to outright evaluate the assets of the transit company and then to transfer it. The other thing that could make the transit district attractive is because the CVTA is already in existence and already has this tax that can go toward transit, a district can be set up without creating another levy and only created as needed over time. So that could be a barrier that can be removed as well, because putting in another tax could also be, it could be a barrier either to the public or to the governing bodies of the localities. Some threats to success is the introducing another agency that is transportation or public transit related. It could provide it could create confusion with the public about who is making various decisions, right? So when there's public transit decisions going on within the region, the general public may not have all the information and may be confused by different governing bodies that may be different entities already in the region. There's also the potential of strain just on human resources. So there are a number of transit agencies already in the region, which all have boards and have sometimes similar members serving on all the boards. In the localities that may have smaller staff or smaller human resources, serving on multiple boards could be an additional burden in that sense. So I would say those are like the two main things, that confusion that it could create of who is making decisions, as well as a potential tax that may receive negatively by the public, as well as that potential burden on human resources. So before I go into discussing the key governance issues, I can take any questions. But
Stephanie, this is Lisa
Yeah.
Guthrie. My question is, in order to create a regional commission, wouldn't legislation be required? So the General Assembly would have to authorize that?
no, so one can be created according to the provisions of the Transportation District Act of 1964. What I did notice though is for the transit commissions that are in existence, like PRTC, MVTA, they have sections of that legislation, the Transit District Act of 1964, that specifically reference them as well. So they can be created, but then the addition, exactly, they're in the code. So there isn't a provision that says they need to be included in the code, but it can be created based on that rule, on that provision. But it just judge based on the existing transit commissions in the area or in the state, they will probably be included in the code. But in the code, there isn't that provision of requiring it, because it's already, that legislation is already available, that Act of 1964.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Jen DeBrule. I would want to have a legal interpretation of that, because I think Lisa is correct that it would require an action of the General Assembly.
Certainly.
And then I'm sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah.
I have another question after Lisa's done.
My second question is there any advantage to this? This would be then a governmental agency financially in terms of taxation and ability to levy municipal bonds. Is there any financial benefit to having a commission, a government authorized commission, handle the business of the transit agencies?
So if I understand your question correctly, is there an advantage to having on the business part of having the transportation district handle the business of public transit because of their authority to issue bonds and other financial?
That's correct.
I would have to, based on what the authority of the current transit agency, the transit company does not have that authority, because it's not that kind of public authority. So definitely that is an advantage, because in that sense, it has like other transit authorities in other states that have that authority to issue bonds or levies, they have that direct financial provision for the services that are provided. So if the Transit District Commission, for example, were to provide transit services, whatever the company needs would be directly related to, will be directly tied to the commission. I don't know if that makes sense. So yes, the short answer is yes, because they are that entity that has the authority already for issuing bonds. So if there's long-term transportation plans that need to be implemented, they can issue bonds in order to fund those transportation improvements, rather than having to go through.
What about tax exemption?
Yes, they also have tax exemption. Yeah, so I didn't list all the powers and authorities, but because they're a public agency, they do have they're exempted from paying taxes on any services or properties that they own or operate.
Thank you.
Stephanie,
Yes.
this is Barb Smith. So the existing transportation districts, what are their purposes? What are they set up for?
So PRTC, they provide, they operate OmniRide. So they provide that commuter services. They also manage, to some extent, the commuter rail service within the region. We have MVTA that does not do transportation planning, but it coordinates with the entities that are in the region. And then Hampton Roads. So the Hampton Roads provides transit service as well. So, and all of these have their funding commission. So MVTA has a fund, that's the MVTF. Hampton Roads also has the two funds, one that was purely highway related, and then the new one that is more transit related. So
Can you go to the slide with those 3 or 4 existing districts?
Yes. Okay. Before I move away from this slide, the reason I brought this slide up is, according to the legislation, these are the only things that are needed for the creation of a transportation district. It's only up to the local governing bodies. There's no mention of legislation by the General Assembly.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Jen DeBrule. And before we move away from this, I think there's a few pieces of this that are getting crossed up. There are 3 different bodies in Northern Virginia, and Northern Virginia Transportation Authority is established under a different code section. They don't have anything to do with transit other than dedicating some regional funding. So I think it might be helpful if we have a side conversation, because I think there's some nuances to Virginia law that are getting lost in this analysis.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so the Northern Virginia Transportation District and Commission, what did you say that what is their primary purpose?
So they fund transit or transportation within the region. They also have a fund.
Transportation, roads, transit, all of it?
Yes, all transportation.
Okay.
So what was just mentioned by the previous speaker, is that, and I'll just have to double check that they weren't created according to this legislation, according to this code provision. They are mentioned there according to what their membership of their district commission should be. They're all listed in terms of district commission membership. But as to whether they have a different code, I'll just have to review that. That is in the information we presented 2 weeks ago.
Okay, so Northern Virginia Transportation District and Commission does a variety of stuff, roads and transit. Potomac Rappahannock Transportation Commission, what do they do?
So they provide transit and commuter rail, so which is all still public transit.
So they're
They
associated
manage,
with
actually, OmniRide. They're associated with OmniRide.
OmniRide. Okay.
Hey, Barb.
Yeah.
This is Jen again. I'm a commissioner on PRTC. So I think there's a deeper dive on this to better understand it. They do operate transit, but they operate regional gas. I mean, they were really established to handle regional gas tax funding in addition to operating transit.
Okay. All right. So should I just leave this alone and we'll get it clarified later?
No, you can. I think you can continue to ask if
I think there are. I will stop after this. I think there are some significant gaps in the analysis, and being the state's alternate on these bodies. I'm concerned that we're spending a lot of time on information that's not 100% clear. And I don't want us to focus a lot of energy on something that may or may not be relevant.
Yeah, I don't want to get myself confused because I'm so confused on transportation districts generally, but I did want to say over there under governance, it says appointed by governing body. I think in your presentation, you said appointed from the governing body. And I think that's an important distinction. If the people that serve on the district commission have to be elected, we need to clarify that bullet.
Members. Okay, so then here, the correct term would be from members of the governing body. So for example, if it's a city, it will be the city council, or if it's a county commission, it'll be members of that body.
Okay, so you're going to correct that bullet.
Yes, from.
And then just, we don't need to talk about this now, but I still don't really understand. It seems like the transportation authorities have the same powers as a transportation district. So I still don't, I think what you have said, Stephanie, is that the advantage of this district is that it doesn't, from your perspective, which might get more clear with discussions with Jen DeBrule, doesn't require legislation and the authority does. So maybe that's, it just seems like they're the same thing. I don't understand why.
Yeah, so I think for me, for the purpose of this study, the main advantage, because remember the purpose of this study is looking at accountability for new transit funds that is within that has been implemented within the region, right? So when it comes to that sort of accountability, looking at CVTA and the transportation district, the main difference would be the potential to actually operate transit, to construct, to operate transit, to acquire and operate its own transit service.
Okay, yeah, I
But
remember you saying that.
Yeah, but compared with the powers of the CVTA, the CVTA can also levy a tax. It can do that kind of transportation planning in that collaborative and cooperative way, any improvements that are needed. So there's a lot of cross, the benefits are, I would say they overlap.
Okay, yeah, that helps a lot. Then only one other thing, which goes way back to the peer review. In the final report, will you have a matrix that includes the facts, those facts, you've got that little fact table?
Yes.
And compares it to GRTC, so it's easy to see it all together?
Yes,
Okay.
certainly. Like we did in the presentation, that same matrix, but now with the addition of Rock Region with more information, so just a big matrix. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Stephanie, this is Dirana.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree that any additional clarity, whether that be from legal representation on the interpretation of the transportation district, be something that we discuss or talk about, as well as any output from your conversations with Jen DeBrule on this topic, as well as one of the, the main question, we talk about realistically what we interpret the governor's request to say what to look at, GRTC structure and why isn't it a transportation district? Again, I think we still, we have to ask that question as well. So I think that some of the things that we're discussing in regard to the transportation district is very important, because we can't, really answer that question. I think that accountability of the regional funds may already exist, and that may be the outcome of, do we need a transportation district or not? Or really where, what what we see GRTC being a regional transportation provider for the region, what that looks like for accountability and participation amongst those on the governing board, and the structure of that really for the overall GRTC as a, again, regional transit provider. So I just want to make sure that we are, we do get that clarification so that we can really answer that question on, why does it need to be a transportation district, and that we clearly all understand what that is and what it can do and can't do, and really some of the purposes it has served across Virginia, as well as what purpose it may or cannot serve for this region.
Yes, thank you very much. I think some of those questions, if just to reiterate, make sure I understand what you said, is answering the question of what is the advantage of having a transportation district provide public transit services within the region? Is that correct?
Yes. And really, and that question can be answered if we can understand what benefits the transportation district have. And again, with some of the highlights or things that Jen highlighted, I think are very important in making and looking at and deciding really whether or not the governance structure that currently exists is appropriate, along with that exists with CVTA. Or is there some benefit to it being a transportation district itself, and any duplication, like you said, in the threat, is that duplication unnecessary because of whatever, limitations or whatever it can or can't do that we don't quite understand right now.
So I want to just say, Lisa posted in the chat, reminding us that the taxes cannot be levied without authorization from the General Assembly. And when we see that with what happened with MVTA and Hampton Roads, which both have the fund that was set up, authorized by the General Assembly. So you have the district commission, but then you also have the funding entity that funds the commission. So I think that's where that comes into play, because you have the HRF and the HRTFF, the new transit fund, and then you have the existing highway fund, and then you have the Northern Virginia Transportation Fund, which are just the funding arms of those transit districts. But then they were implemented, or they were authorized by the General Assembly, those funding bodies. So that is correct. So then if a transportation district is created and an associated fund to levy a tax or a millage of some kind is to be levied, it would have to be authorized. And looking at the existing agencies or the existing district commissions, it means another transportation district fund would have to be set up to fund that district commission. So that addresses Lisa's comment.
Yeah, and I think, and just to add to that, Stephanie, I think that with the presentation that MBTA gave to the CVTA full body at the end of the last month, they talked about the bond validation process as they tested the validity of the code, the 1964 code, and that creation, and whether or not they could bond or not. So I think that too probably goes to Lisa's and Jen's point, and yours now, to that authority of actually levying taxes.
Okay. Yeah, so they have the authority. It's not, there's no question as to yes or no, but the process in which it will be implemented is what will need to be clarified. If it has to go to the General Assembly, which is most likely yes, because in Virginia you can't do that without it going to the to the General Assembly.
And
It
Stephanie,
can issue bonds. Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to ask real quick, and sorry, did you see the text thread here? Lisa had some follow-up points.
Yes, yes. So I just
Okay.
addressed, yes, I addressed.
Very good.
Yeah, so the sources of revenue are the funds that need to be set up. And so in terms of the powers to levy the tax and to issue bonds, those are in the legislation and they can do that. The mechanism through which maybe that can be done is what maybe the legal interpretation would be required. But in general, they do have the authority to. And so looking at looking at the key governance issues that we identified in the study, we can look at how the transportation district can solve those issues. I think that's the main question that we want to answer. Not like what are all the provisions of the transportation district, but how can the provisions of the transportation district help us to solve the key issues that we've identified in the Richmond region, so that we can be very targeted. So, and we can add, you can correct me if we omitted anything, but the main issues that I think have come out from a lot of the discussion with the various stakeholders and throughout the course of this study is four main things, right? So first, I would say is the decision making and accountability. Second, board representation, which is related to the decision making. Then third, the implications for GRTC ownership because of its current structure, the way it was set up, having shareholders. And then fourth, which is grayed out, is the potential news evaluation of potential new services, because now we have more members of the CVTA providing contributions towards transit within the region that may not currently have transit service in their areas. Now that is grayed out because I believe there's a separate study that is looking at that, about what is the appropriate level of service for those CVTA members and how does that look like. So these are the four main issues that I think have come up with the decision making, making sure that we have that. What does it look like, or how can we ensure representation by elected officials? Can the transportation district allow that? Yes. How do we ensure decision equity, considering historical investment into the system and future contributions? Can we do that through some sort of tiered approach, phased-in approach, either through transfer of assets, paying for the full amount of those transit assets, or looking at the way it can depreciate over time and making that correspond with the board representation? Yes, the details would have to be agreed on by the members. And looking at board representation, one major issue now is representation of Henrico on the board. There's the official request to be part of the board, but then through our stakeholder interviews, we also heard of some of the smaller jurisdictions also wanting representation. How can board representation be made, and how can a transportation district allow for that? Yes, the transportation district will provide that platform of creating something new from start, where you can agree on who the members are and what that membership is going to look like. What are the implications for GRTC ownership? Like I said before, is it going to be a complete transfer of the 50-50 share by some sort of assessed value of the current assets as well as historical investments? Or is it going to be some sort of looking at it in a phased approach? Are we going to have equal partners, or is it going to be tiered ownership? These are the main issues that I think need to be addressed, or that the CVTM members are interested in addressing. So before moving forward, I just want to confirm that. And then the next few slides, if you have 5 more minutes, is just um, showing what the potential, some recommendations that we would be exploring with the stakeholders as well as the GRTC legal counsel are. So before I move on, are there any other main issues that have not been captured under these 4, or let me say these 3, in the purview of this study? Okay. Okay. So we're now looking at what are the potential paths to address these key governance issues. We see the four main approaches or 4 main potential paths. Now, again, these are just the initial draft, or these are the initial structures that we are looking at. We have to go into detail about what that would look like with the legal counsel, as well as, oh, sorry. Barb, do you have a question or comment?
No, sorry, I just left my raised hand up for too long.
Oh, okay, no worries. So with these recommendations that we are looking at, or potential paths, we'll have feedback from the stakeholders to make sure that it is something that can be looked at and what the final recommendation would look like. So the first is looking at maintaining the current structure. So the current structure is City of Richmond and County of Chesterfield are the board members of GRTC, and then they run the operations of GRTC. Anything else is through contractor service. So that would be maintaining the current structure, seeing as that the potential issues that would arise if this current structure is maintained would be still all those governance issues that we identified, questions of equity, of accountability, of representation. Second is looking at having Henrico County as a third member of the board. So having a board not only comprised of Richmond and Chesterfield, but then also Henrico County. Then the board governs GRTC as is. Now, some of the issues that will have to be dealt with, or details, would be what would that look like? Will Henrico be a third partner? Will it be 33, 33, 33? How will that transfer take place? Will it just be the existing 2 reduce their share for Henrico to be a third and equal partner, or is it still going to be tiered in some way? What is that agreement that the 2 entities can come to in terms of ownership? Because there's no point in having still 50-50 ownership and having a board with 3 different jurisdictions. Although that is possible because the current owners have to approve of the board, right? So even if the board has the members, but they still need this layer of approval required from the stakeholders, then it's sort of artificial. So whatever changes in the board that are made, they need to be reflected in the changes of the ownership of the company. A third option would be to provide a path for board membership for all the entities that are interested, right? So throughout our conversation with over 40 individuals, we kept wanting representation. Now that representation can be in terms of service without board representation, but wanting some sort of service within their jurisdictions, or wanting a seat on the board. So what does that look like? And this can be done. That path for membership, any changes to the board, it can be done according to the bylaws. Again, it needs to be approved by the owners of the company. So then what I previously stated about having artificial authority needs to be addressed. Any changes in the board needs to be reflected in the ownership of the company. this path to board membership, I think this is where the creative thinking of Rock Region comes into play. Looking at a combination of a tiered, it could either be equal partners, or having that tiered representation, having primary members or secondary members or even tertiary members based on a combination of the costs that are required to provide whatever service is warranted within those jurisdictions, by looking at not only the cost of provision, but the full cost. So what are those fixed costs needed? What are those variable costs needed? And what is that commitment that would be required? Can I opt in and then opt out next year? Will there be required maybe a 5-year commitment if you want service, or for any kind of provision? It can be a combination of the amount of contributions, service levels, or even population, which should be, it should correlate with the service level, service beneficiaries. And finally, we think a fourth path would be creating a new transportation district. Now, what this would look like would be the owners of the current members of CVTA, in addition to the CVT chair or designee. The path that would make sense for creating a transportation district would be for the transportation district to acquire the transit company by either transfer of its assets, by assessing the current value and transferring it, and transferring the complete ownership from the two primary shareholders. So the governance would then be by the district commission, whose members would be those that that are represented by the CVTA. Now, having that membership on the district commission could, again, has the opportunity for creating that tiered representation based on the same factors that I mentioned before. That also provides the opportunity for that sort of like layered decision making in some sense. Now, I'd say the main thing here, with the difference between option 4 and option 3, again, would be that GRTC would directly now be under, or would be under the umbrella of the district commission. So it would be completely acquired, and it would be the district commission providing those transit services. So these are the 4 main paths to address the governance issues that we've looked at that have potential to address some of the issues now. The next steps that we have to complete are looking at the evaluating the main advantages and disadvantages of each governance structure, reviewing those recommendations with the GRTC legal counsel, and then getting that feedback, for stakeholder feedback. So at this point, I'll take any additional questions as well. Any thoughts at all on any of the potential paths to success that we've outlined? Are there any that are more, you think are more attractive than others? And any potential pitfalls of any of the 4 options compared to the others?
Stephanie, this is Todd with Enrico.
Yes, Todd.
So I think we don't really have all the collective information and some of the nuances that Mr. Brule was referencing to maybe give fully educated response at this point. I think one of the pieces of information that would be helpful to the group at some point when appropriate, with respect to the, especially if you're looking at transportation district, is how many of the rurals in the course of the stakeholder interviews said that they would like a voice at the table. You know, what does that count look like? Is it one or two, or is it all of the rural? So that kind of helps inform that decision-making process amongst other things.
Thank you. I think that's important as well. So yeah, we'll get that count. For the most part, it was reiterated by it may not necessarily be board representation, but they also want some service. So we'll just identify the ones that we're more interested in just having service versus board representation. So thank you.
Stephanie,
And
another question that I hope that we will take up at some point is, and maybe you found this looking at the Arkansas study or whatever, as far as local funding, because for some of the rules, particularly for the amount of their share of the funding of CVTA, it probably would not be sufficient to fund transit service in those counties. So would there be a cost share obligation for the counties to participate to make that commitment to bring service to their counties? And so how was that authority versus local funding question addressed in some of these other states and other case studies you've looked at?
yes, so in this case of the smaller jurisdictions wanting transit service, again, we want to make sure that the full cost of the service is paid for. And the reason I thought the Arkansas one was very interesting was that they had found a way to do that by calculating what the actual cost of providing the service would be, looking at what it costs for providing those fixed costs versus the variable cost that has to do with hours, service hours or service miles. So those are some details that would have to be addressed when it comes to what service is being provided, right? It would, I would say they're the nitty gritties that we may not, we could address it at a high level, but in terms of having that calculation at this point in the details, I don't know if that is appropriate in looking at governance. I think agreeing that some sort of cost that can be agreed upon is the first step. Having that structure in place of agreeing that, okay, we are going to pay the full cost. If our contribution is 40K per month or per year, we understand that this is not the full amount to receive service. What are we going to do about it? Okay, we are ready to commit for the next 2 years. You provide us this amount of service and we'll commit this amount of dollars to it. That can be a provision that is written into, and again, it can be purely just for service or for representation, for governance, because one does not need to be on the board to receive service. So then in that sense, it would be on the service side, the service study. But then if they do want board representation for whatever service that they receive, then it becomes, I think then it becomes related to this study. But if it's purely service, I believe there's a service study that is currently going on. It's a simultaneous study.
Yeah, Stephanie, that is an overlap that I think you on one of your slides distinguished with that grade box.
Mm-hmm.
The governance versus service, it
Yeah.
overlaps to a certain degree, but at the same time, the evaluation of potential new service seems to be something that might fall more appropriately into the regional transit plan discussion rather than the governance. But definitely there's this overlap, which makes it a bit confusing.
Yes. Any other comments or questions or concerns? So with moving forward, we're going to look at how those different structures address these three key issues that we've identified. If there are no further questions, comments, or concerns, then I would say that thank you very much for staying a few minutes over to continue this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I think that it is important to reiterate. I mean, we've got some work to do, I think, on the transportation district discussion, and we'll circle back on that. It is important to reiterate that this is a report to the Governor and General Assembly and doesn't imply that CVTA has the power to do much of what's being discussed. It's a bigger decision in terms of the district and some of the governance decisions. So the report will be drafted and will come to the CVTA to deliver back to the Governor and General Assembly. The next meeting right now that we have on our calendar is May 21st. And we will be following up probably between now and then with you all to give updates on where things stand. So we're getting close to the end of when the report is due, and we want to make sure that we have that done and through the proper channels before it is submitted at the end of June. Anybody have other questions or comments today?
Chat. Yep, thanks. Quickly, spoke with Miss Page yesterday, and she did want to see if we could reach out to Powhatan staff to see if they wanted to be on the or be able to listen in to the subcommittee on the transit governance. So I did want to pass that along to you, Chet. And then finally, just to say happy Mother's Day weekend to all the ladies out there with those beautiful children.
Sure, thank you. And Nicole, I think we do have Powhatan representation on the committee already. So we'll follow up if needed, but I think Brett Chardon is on the committee.
And I'm sorry. New Kent. Okay. Sorry.
We'll double check. No problem.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and thanks for the well wishes. Happy Mother's Day to everybody out there. And otherwise, I appreciate your time and thanks for staying over a few minutes. We will talk to you all soon. Thanks. Have a great weekend.